Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here to celebrate Shabbat. This evening, we're going to be making up for an omission in our congregational calendar that hit last week. Last week, we observed our confirmation Shabbat, but it also used to be a very important holiday in the Jewish calendar, known as May Day. Now, you might think, May Day, that's a communist holiday. What does it have to do with Judaism? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit later tonight, because there's been some new interest in a Jewish socialist organization called the Bund, which we'll find out more about a little bit later tonight. So this is May Day delayed, if you think of it that way. But in the meantime, we are going to be observing Shabbat because it's important in our busy lives and in our hectic lives and in our sometimes not stable lives out there in the outside world to create a space of pause and quiet, reflection and contemplation. And so that's why we come together once a week to create that space. And so I'll invite you to sing along with our opening song, which is a song that celebrates being together, Hine Ma Tov. More than the Jewish people has kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. Shabbat is a unique contribution to world culture. Other peoples have observed days without work or times for special gatherings, but stopping one day out of every 7, when even animals, children, and servants do not labor, is a Jewish original. To be sure, how we stop and why we stop has changed. For some, detailed restrictions and obligations consume the day. Others use the opportunity to explore Jewish identity, family time, or the importance of rest and recreation as they choose. As for why, even the Torah cannot decide. Deuteronomy claims it recalls the end of Egyptian slavery, while Exodus says Shabbat echoes divine creation of the world. Why has Shabbat survived when animal sacrifice and the Jerusalem temple are long gone? Because Shabbat meets human needs: reflection, community, silence, solidarity. Shabbat connects us with our past and gives us time and space in the present to prepare for the future. So I invite us to take a moment to pause, to breathe, to release, and simply to be. And now to light our Shabbat candles this evening, I'd like to invite Rick Bolnick, our Onik host, as we sing Baruch HaOr, let us light these lights.
Let us
The sharing of wine is a way of creating community. Community not only in the present with those who share it together, but also between the present and the past, those who created the concept of wine and developed it and honed the technology, and even those in our own days that created this wine that we share tonight, however many moons ago it was. And so we feel the connection to each other, to the natural world, and to our past as well as our present. I'll sing our blessing in Hebrew, and please feel free to join me in Hebrew and or in English. Baruch haor ba'olam, Baruch haor ba'adam, Borei pri hagafen. Blessed is the light in the world, blessed is the light of humanity that brings forth the fruit of the vine. L'chaim, l'chaim, to life. The Third Wire by Lawrence Levine. Have you ever noticed how machines are governed by those three wires that seem to run the show? Well, it is the third wire, the one that they call the ground, that brings things down. It is said that the third wire goes straight down into the center of the earth. So I believe this is the way for us to bind to the world. I mean, to all those that we have loved that were in the end attached to the respirator and to the kidney dialyzer, all those Sunday calls, the voices that spoke to us through the telephone or left messages on the machine. They are all gone now. But in their years, we leaned together on this planet and through the third wire, touched our ancient ancestral heart deep in the middle of the earth. Each Shabbat that we gather, we pause for a moment of reflection and tribute to those of our loved ones who may not be with us anymore. They could be recent losses, or they could be losses of years past that speak to us in this season and remind us of the love they gave. And so in this season and in this moment, I do want to remember Rhonda Hart, a longtime member of our community who passed away this week. And I also want to open up to create a space for those here, if you would like to share a name, a memory of someone you cared about, please feel free to speak their name out loud at this time, or to share their message in the chat if you prefer for those online.
Lillian Herter.
Salome.
Let us pause for a moment of silent tribute to their memory and in memory of all of our loved ones. In Jewish life, we say, Zecher Tzadikim Livracha, the memory of good people is a blessing. Please reflect as these words are sung. Well, this evening, our menorah is emblematic of the many strands in our lives that come together. Its 7 lights remind us of the 7 days of the week, but also they're a way of connecting our many individual lights that come together in one congregation. I do want to light the first candle in memory of Rhonda Hart. Many of you had the chance to know Rhonda or her husband, Robert, through his volunteering in the choir. Rhonda was a wonderful, warm personality who was very bright and welcoming, a big booster of our community and congregation. And so we will miss her very much and her involvement in our activities. But we also are grateful for the time we had with her. She finally succumbed to cancer after something like 30 years of off and on dealing with diagnoses. And so it really is amazing that she made it as long as she did. And even if we're not grateful that she is gone, we are grateful that she was here. And so now I'm happy to turn it over to you to come forward and light a candle, or for those online to light a candle or unmute. And I see Roger already has his hand up, so go for it, Roger.
I'd like to light a candle for two reasons. It's the circle of life. On Monday, our daughter Jessica had a baby girl, Morel Lily. She was 8 pounds 2 ounces, and she had her at home, and she's doing really well.
And she's beautiful.
And she's beautiful. And then the next day, Sue's cousin Andy Pine, who's our age and lives in Northbrook, was passed away from Alzheimer's. So, and then we adopted a new pup. Not a pup, a 2-year-old dog for our family. So that's the circle of life.
So 2 arrivals and 1 goodbye.
Yeah.
Ron and Tamara, please. And by the way, the sound in the room today is a little bit wonky, so please speak as loudly as possible. I apologize for the tech issue. Go ahead.
So we have been trying to get things in place for Ron's hip surgery, which is in 2.5 weeks. And we are also now in the process of looking for a new cleaning lady, because the one we had, it was just getting too stressful. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is supposed to be helping us. So we are going to be talking to a couple of people. So hopefully that is going to simplify our lives a little bit. And Ron and I just had a wedding anniversary on May 3rd. So I'm very glad he's still with me, and I hope to keep him around for a lot more years.
Great. Thank you. If you can use the mic, I'm sorry, for the people online.
To note some recent developments with our 3 kids. In recent months, Lana, who had worked for a publisher that went out of business, got a new job and is off to a pretty good start, and was just visiting her colleagues the past 2 days. Number 2, Isaac recently joined a band and has been performing with them, and we've saw a couple times, including at the Cubby Bear, and it's a lot of fun. And then Sophie recently was the lead publisher of a scientific paper that's a good milestone on her way to a PhD. And then also tomorrow, it happens to be Irene's birthday, so it's been some good news of late.
I see. I had a first cousin, Eddie, who I didn't really know very well, but I got to know a little bit in the last year. And about a month ago, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and was told he had 3 months to live. So the week after that, he wrote a letter to all of his friends, and it was labeled goodbye. It was a goodbye letter and all the things he wanted to say. And he lives in California, where you are able to take your own life as long as you take the pills. And so he didn't want his kids to see him suffer, and he didn't want to suffer. And so a week later, with an oncologist there, he took many sleeping pills and passed away. And I respect him for that. It made me think that I may have an opportunity to do that, but I may die suddenly someday and not have that opportunity. So I've written my letter, which my family has to give if I don't have that opportunity.
Rick was reminding me. Okay, I'll light it. This week on Monday, my aunt, my mom's sister-in-law died, and she was absolutely competent and clear, and she made her own decision too. Not quite, but she was able to make her own decision to cease doing anything to prolong her life or prolong her death, however you want to see it. And she made an amazing, I think, courageous decision to stop dialysis and be able to say goodbye to people. And she was a bright, funny, really warm, caring person. And I really respected and admired her last act, which was to make the decision herself. And really, it was, I think, her last gift to her kids, that she was able to make the decision herself. And she, after like several days after she made the decision, she quietly passed. And it's sad, but she had a wonderful life, and I respected her last act.
So as I was getting ready to come here tonight, because my allergies have been going nuts. I don't know if anyone else has allergies, but it has been bad. So I scooped up a handful of cough drops. And as I did, I had one of those memory moments. And what I remembered was on Friday nights going to Heller Nature Center and pulling the big electric keyboard out of that closet and setting it up. And then Lois would arrive with her handful of cough drops, and she would line them up on the keyboard, the edge of that keyboard. So, you could sort of know the pattern or how long the service had gone based on how many cough drops were no longer on Lois's keyboard. And because I don't use cough drops that often, but I thought I'd better have a couple just in case. And it made me smile. Her birthday is coming up later this month. And it made me think about legacy, because I feel like every note we sing, and no matter who is sitting at that keyboard, I hear Lois's introductions to those songs. I hear the way Lois played them, no matter how they're actually being played. So although I miss her terribly, I cherish the gifts she's left us.
In 1897, two aspirational Jewish organizations were founded. One was founded in August in Basel, Switzerland, a part of the world with not that many Jews, and not just because of the skiing. That organization was the World Zionist Congress, which still meets in its modified forms even to this day. The other organization, founded in 1897, was founded in October, a couple months later, in Vilna. Now, Vilna was a very Jewish part of the world. The city itself had 60,000 Jews in 1897. Over 40% of the city was Jewish. This organization was called the General Jewish Labor Bund, or for short, just the Bund. Both the Zionist movement and the Bundist movement were responding to the same suffering faced by European Jews, especially the millions of Jews in the Russian Empire. But even though they faced the same problems, they had very different answers. As I describe three problems and three sets of answers, I want to ask you, consider which set of answers you would have found more relevant, more practical, more possible all those years ago. Problem number one. The Jews are suffering because they are poor. The Zionist solution? Let's raise a lot of money to buy land for a future state in a corner of the Ottoman Empire where they could move thousands of miles and start farming collectives. That will solve the problem. Now, even if there was a strand of the Zionist movement that called itself Labor Zionism, was focused on work, they generally focused on Jewish workers doing their work there in the future state and not where they were at the time until they went to the future state. Here's the Bundist answer to Jews are suffering because they're poor. We should organize unions for better working conditions in the industries Jews are already working in. We should be part of the global socialist movement and the global working class. So it's not just Jewish workers that are organizing, but Jewish workers next to Italian workers, next to Polish workers. And ultimately, we should work toward a workers' revolution that would end poverty for everyone. And that would solve the problem. If there's no more poverty, there's no more poor Jews. As the American Jewish socialist Meyer London put it in 1905, when there was a Russian Revolution afoot and people had hopes that this was it, the socialists were going to win. As he put it, the goal is not to again be led out of Egypt, as in the Exodus. The goal is to work together to free Egypt itself. The focus was on the workers here where they were, and not there in the future. Second problem. Jews are suffering because of legal discrimination and anti-Semitism, especially the new versions dawning in the 19th century of racialist anti-Semitism beyond simply anti-religious animus. What was the Zionist response to suffering from discrimination and anti-Semitism? Their response was, admit it, the Europeans will never welcome Jews as full citizens. Remember, the mass of Jews living in the Russian Empire, that was the largest Jewish community in Europe, because that included Poland and what today is part of Austria and other kingdoms. Those Jews were not citizens. In fact, they couldn't move anywhere they wanted to. They were confined to something called the Pale of Settlement. There was no voting for anything in Russia in 1897. There wasn't even a fake parliament at the time. And don't forget, the title Tsar derives from the title Caesar, emperor, dictator. And even in Western Europe, where by the 1870s Jews were emancipated and had some legal protections and legal citizenship, nevertheless, there were social exclusions and, as I mentioned, this rising new kind of anti-Semitism. And the Zionists would argue an endemic anti-Semitism. It's always going to be there. And if there's going to be conflicts between ethnic groups, which will be inevitable as they compete with each other, you need to be strong and fight back. But the way you fight back is with an army and a nation that advocates for you. You can't do it just as a group of people in a city. The answer the Zionists offered to endemic anti-Semitism and persecution and even legal disability was give up, leave. Leave for the historic land of Israel, create your own state, and there you'll have your own industries. You'll run the schools, you'll run the universities, you'll have an army that can fight for you. And you'll run it all in your historical language of Hebrew, which, to be fair, almost nobody speaks in 1897. Ultimately, it was a message of pessimism. They would say realism, right? No pessimist says they're a pessimist. They're always a realist. The Zionists were pessimists about the future of Jews in Europe. What was the Bundist answer in 1897? If the Jews are suffering with legal discrimination, even anti-Semitism, we need to fight with others for democracy and civil rights for all. They'll see that we are on the same team. If we focus on class solidarity, the workers will see that we are workers like them. And if we have our particular needs in our particular culture as Jews, we can advocate for what they called cultural autonomy within a multi-ethnic empire. If you've got Ukrainians and Poles and Belarusians and Jews in the Russian Empire, let the Ukrainians speak Ukrainian. Let the Polish speak Polish. And let the Jews speak Yiddish, which was their ethnic cultural language. Give them the chance to not only use their language, but to run their own schools, print their own newspapers with no censorship, organize theater and performances, and simply experience a Jewish street. The Jews in Eastern Europe already spoke Yiddish. You didn't have to teach them something new that they didn't know. So that they could speak and, in many cases, read. If there's violence, you fight back. Both the Bund and the Zionists fought back many times, including famously in the Warsaw Ghetto. But the ultimate goal is to end hatred, and end specifically the hatred that comes from ethnic or national conflict. After all, ultimately, even if the Bund were cultural autonomists, or some would call them diaspora nationalists, I'll talk about that in a moment, ultimately they were anti-nationalists. They didn't want borders and boundaries. They wanted us to all be part of one happy socialist family and to fight against chauvinism that comes from any kind of nationalism, to fight against the hatred that comes when nations conflict with each other, to reduce and even eliminate the conflict between peoples that isn't necessary. They were vindicated in the short term. After World War I, you may know that there was almost a civil war in Russia between the whites and the reds. And the whites killed Jews by the hundreds of thousands. And the Reds defended them. And the Red Army was led by a former Jew named Leon Trotsky. So in some ways, the Bundists were optimists. They had hope that solidarity and shared cause and struggle could break down those barriers, could reduce the hatred, could lead to a lasting Jewish home where they were. Third problem, not just practical issues of poverty and legal discrimination and hatred. The Jews are suffering from a modern identity crisis. The old world religion of traditionalism doesn't work for modern educated Jews. And if your Judaism is not a religion, which was the Reform movement's answer in the late 19th century, they said, we are a religion and not an ethnic community. But if that doesn't work for you because you're not religious, and you're not just going to do the tradition because it's old, what does being Jewish by ethnicity, by peoplehood, by nation maybe, what does that mean? Why bother being Jewish? And how do you do it once you decide you want to do it? Now, there were some Jews who were so modernist, they left the Jewishness behind, like Trotsky. They said, we're done. I'm done. That's past. I'm future. But there were plenty who wanted to stay Jewish in some way. And that includes both the Zionists and the Bundists. The Zionist response of what's going to motivate me to be Jewish is to work for the cause. I'm going to build the future state. That's my goal. That's my mission in life. Ask not what your future country has done for you. The content of their Jewish identity would be this new Hebrew language and culture that they were creating on the fly. In the end, they said, for Jewishness to survive, particularly if you're not religious, You need to be surrounded by other Jews living in a Jewish culture and a Jewish language as the majority. That's the only way to guarantee the Jews survive, because living in a diaspora as a minority, it's galut, it's exile, using the old Hebrew term. And you'll be homeless in diaspora. What you need is a homeland to be at home, and to have a home, and to have a home in the future with your vibrant and true identity. That was the Zionist answer to this crisis of Jewish identity. What did the Bundists say? They also wanted to preserve Judaism. They did not choose to go off into the universalism of pure communism. The Bund said, our cause is this workers' revolution for democracy and freedom and prosperity for all, but also the dignity of distinct cultural identities. We could be Jewish in our culture, and our political idealism would be in the language that Jews speak and where they already were living and working in their masses. They came up with an ideology they called Doigkeit, here-ness. We're going to fix it here and now, the way we are here and now. And we can choose from our Jewish inheritance. There's a fascinating document from the American Jewish Labor Movement where they describe which holidays they want to celebrate in their schools. And they celebrated Hanukkah. Makes sense. They certainly love Passover. I mean, a workers' rebellion against the Tsar, against the Pharaoh. That's great. They did not celebrate Rosh Hashanah. They did not celebrate Yom Kippur. Those were too religious. That was about God and judgment and forgiveness and blech. So they did some things, but not other things. They liked Purim, was a family holiday. They liked Lag BaOmer, which is about the Bar Kokhba rebellion as it's been interpreted, but didn't do Shavuot, which is the whole point of Lag BaOmer, where you're counting days and you take a break in the middle. Didn't matter. They chose from their past what was meaningful to them. And of course, they could add to that calendar, including the holiday of May Day, which was a holiday. I also love in that list of holidays, it says you should observe the Russian Revolution, but each school gets to choose which date they want to observe that on. Because there was a spring revolution in February, March, and there was a winter revolution in October, November, plus this is the Gregorian calendar or the Julian calendar. So they just said, you should do it, but pick which day, you pick which day by school is meaningful to you. But ultimately, they were living this paradox. Diaspora nationalism. Do you hear the paradox? I'm dispersed, I'm a minority, and yet I'm claiming all the rights of a majority nation. The reality was, in the Jewish experience, in many cases, they were that. In some cities, certainly in neighborhoods. Imagine being in Vilna, where 40% of the population is Jewish. How do you think that breaks out by neighborhood? My guess is there are some neighborhoods that are 70%, 80%, 90% Jewish. If you're living there, you are the majority. You are experiencing that ethnic nationhood. So you could be a diaspora nationalist in a world like that. And that's the origin of this wonderful story of the Jewish Bund, written by Molly Crabapple. It's just out now. It's called Here Where We Live is Our Country. And that's the message. This is our country. We don't need to be anywhere else. We don't need a homeland elsewhere. Our home is here. Now you had those three sets of answers: to poverty, to oppression, and to identity. Which set was more compelling to you? Which seemed more possible and plausible in that time and place? Which party would you support by voting or donating? Which school system and summer camps and youth groups would you join? Well, the last one about the youth groups is a trick question, because the correct answer on youth groups is you join the one with the cutest boys or girls, depending on your taste. And that was often the case. People would move for that reason. Ultimately, the ideology of the Bund was that I didn't need to be elsewhere, and being elsewhere would create its own problems. I'm going to fix things here and now and demand my rights here and now as a member of my community and my national identity. And by the way, this happened even after they moved away from here. If here was Eastern Europe, they kept that ideology of citizenship and equal rights and pushing for progressive change when they moved to New York, when they moved to Chicago or to Melbourne, Australia, or the many other places that Bundists went up around the world. Now, what were the ultimate results of this Zionist movement? They established a state, the state of Israel. They facilitated the rebirth of the Hebrew language. They created a vibrant modern culture, and often a vibrant secular modern Jewish culture. They did turn into a place of refuge for Jewish people in distress from all over the world, not just Europe, but also the Middle East, Asia, and everywhere else. And that's true for now, at least. There's a bill that's just being debated right now in the Israeli government through a ministerial committee that would eliminate non-Orthodox conversions from being recognized in the land of Israel. So that'll solve the problems. That's what they need to focus on right now, is telling more people you're not welcome. Well, you see, the problem is that Zionism has run into is the complications of a nation state, and building a nation state when it's primarily for one people. Defining who's in that people is one problem. But then, of course, you also have the larger problem of what if there are other people in that state on that land as you're beginning your process? What if there are conflicting visions of what a Jewish state means? I'm going to talk about this more next week when I talk about Jerusalem Day on an almost anniversary of the Six-Day War and the conquest of Jerusalem. Now, what were the ultimate results of the Bund? We don't see the Bund around like we see Israel around. We don't hear Yiddish the way we hear Hebrew. The Bundists stayed. They did not leave. Of course, many Zionists also were unable to leave, given all the borders closed and the unwillingness of other countries to take them. So the Bund stayed, and most of them were murdered by a bloody 20th century. There were the Tsarist and anti-Semitic pogroms that killed them by the hundreds and the thousands. There was the Nazi Holocaust that killed them by the millions. And then they were smothered by a Soviet communist oppression that solved anti-Semitism by erasing Judaism, simply making it not polite to talk about. So what do we do to evaluate this? And Crabapple describes a scene in her epilogue that I think speaks to this challenge of how do we evaluate the Bund. Okay, they were right, one friend told me after he finished the manuscript. They were right and they were dead. What's the big lesson you want us to take away from that? After all, the Bund failed. Lost, I answered, more sharply than I meant. What's the difference between failed and lost? He responded. Failure is what happened to those who are overcome by their own faults and errors. To lose is to succumb to a greater force. She goes on to explain, it was the Nazis that killed the Bund. It wasn't the Bund that is to blame for their deaths. It's not the Bund that's to blame for Stalinist oppression. They had insights into the human condition, into the Jewish condition. They had insights into the weakness of the Zionist perspective and the problems that it would incur. And so you can't live life backwards. History doesn't happen backwards. The Bundists of the 1910s can't know that Hitler is coming 30 years later. This argument between the Bund and the Zionists was a very hot argument in 1906. It was a very hot argument in 1926. Here is an example of Crabapple channeling some of the old hostilities. And I find that sometimes she's read so much Bundist literature to write the book, and the index is really amazing in her references, that she's imbibed all these Bundist critiques of the Zionists. And so she's sort of reenacting the arguments all over again. But I also find that sometimes she is reading history backwards a little bit. She's critiquing the Zionists of then for things that the Zionists of later or the Zionists of now have done or are doing at the time she was writing. But in any case, she's describing the founding of the Bund and the founding of the Zionists, and then she says, the two groups had been enemies from the start. They couldn't have been more different. Well, one could have been religious. They were both secular. One could have been right-wing. The other left. They were both left-wing. One could have been focused on the elites, and one could have been focused on they were both focused on the workers. So there are a lot of similarities, but when you're in an intense argument, you don't want to admit any similarity whatsoever. So she's, again, reliving this dynamic. But here's what the Bund had to think about the Zionist project. The Bund found the entire idea delusional. How would Zionists convince Europe's 9 million Jews to move to tiny Palestine? And what would they do with the people living there? The whole project was a fanciful distraction from the real battles that Jewish workers faced in Eastern Europe. Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist leader who became the first president of Israel, wrote in 1903, "Our hardest struggle everywhere is conducted against the Bund." While the Bund described Zionism as the most evil enemy of the organized Jewish proletariat. The Bund banned Zionists from membership, and the two groups would tussle on the lecture podium and in the streets. Bundesleader Vladimir Medem himself spent many nights arguing with Zionist orators in various student colonies. And yet he was still curious to check out what the Zionist movement was about, and he describes the scene when he goes to Basel. So we have these arguments that go back a long time, and yet we're talking about them in 2026. Why? Aside from my historical interest in this subject. Well, a clear reason is described a little bit earlier on that same page when she describes this encounter. She says, the Bund's ideas today have found an audience. They had a moral clarity and a toughness that has attracted young Jews seeking a heritage beyond the Jewish state. Sorry, the Israeli state, she says. After 2023 and what happened in Gaza, this rediscovery reached a fever pitch. The Bund's anti-Zionism, which had so marginalized them during the long decades of Israeli communal dominance, would lead a new generation to embrace them. And so she finds young Jews have reached out to her. She wrote a well-shared article in the New York Review of Books about the Bund, and it activated people's interest in this phenomenon because here we have Jewish anti-Zionists today looking for their own roots. And they could find religious sources for that in the reform movements, anti-ethnicity statements, or the ultra-Orthodox movements, rejections, but they're not Orthodox and they're not that religious. And the fact that they're leftists and the Bund were leftists is just a bonus. So they can agree on politics as well as their critique of Israel. The Bundist critiques of Zionism's then future were resonating with them, as Israel itself has become more right-wing and more ethno-nationalist, especially in the optics of the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank and now Lebanon since October 7th. When you see the demolished landscape of Gaza, and then you see a picture of the Warsaw Ghetto after the revolt there, and people compare the two and they say, really? Is this what we're doing? Is this what's happening again? Well, ultimately, when people look for roots, they want to find resonance and they want to find parallels, and they find some in the Bund in its critique of Zionism, if that's what you want to emphasize. Now, I learned about the Bund in our rabbinic training at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. We spent a lot of time learning about the Bund, but it was not because of their socialism. And it was not because of their anti-Zionism either. We learned about them because they were secular and because they were describing a creative new Jewish identity, not based on religion. It's a major root of our broader movement of secular humanistic Judaism. After all, they came to religion thinking it was the opiate of the masses. It's designed to keep people passive and subordinate. They wanted to use Yiddish to make new Jewish culture. They were interested in women's freedom and women's education and liberation. In fact, they included young girls in their schools, and it was so tempting that the ultra-Orthodox started what's called the Beis Yaakov school system to compete with the Bund schools. Because the Bund schools, called the Zeisho schools, enrolled everybody. And even Orthodox Jews wanted their daughters to learn to read and some math and some life skills. And so the Orthodox didn't care about women's education before. But now that they had competition from another Jewish school that was so heretical that would lead them astray, now they had to come up with something else. So it changed the Orthodox world too, not just the secular world. And ultimately, their values were to be humane, to be humanitarian, and to have a humanistic ethos regarding human suffering, that we have to fix problems ourselves in this world with our hands and together. And most importantly, respecting diversity and the humanity of other peoples too. That tolerance that they wanted to see would be reflected in how they treated others. I was struck to read a passage in the book where she describes how the underground radio run by the Bund in the Warsaw Ghetto applauded the quest for Indian independence that Gandhi was enacting in that same time period. because they had heard reports from other places in their clandestine radio listening, and they were demonstrating their solidarity with the oppressed peoples of the world, even in the moment of their deepest oppression. Amazing. Now, I did find this a bummer. In this book, with all of its great detail, there are plenty of examples of the secularism of this movement and its challenging of religion and how the religion didn't like how they were changing things, their creativity in response to holidays, even that deploying of the story of the Exodus from Egypt to say, we're not going to leave Egypt, we're going to fix Egypt instead of leaving. Secular does not appear in the index of the book. The word appears in the book, but it wasn't index worthy when they were designing the index. So, boo to that. Now, why is the Bund not heard about anymore? Well, as I mentioned, the Nazi Holocaust decimated Eastern European Jewish masses. In fact, decimate isn't strong enough of a word. You may know decimate comes from the Roman army where they would kill 1 out of every 10 of a cowardly unit. That's only 1/10. 50% of the Jews of Europe were killed during the Holocaust. And after all, the Bund was built for Jewish masses, but those masses were gone. They weren't there anymore. They had been mass murdered. The Soviet Union also wiped out the Bund in many ways. The Bolsheviks forced the dissolution of a separate Bundist organization in Russia proper. They created what they called the Yevsektia, the Jewish sections of the Soviet Party, of the Soviet state, that promoted secular Jewish culture for a certain number of years and then closed the door, wiped it out, and killed all the poets. In the 1930s, many of the purges that went through the Russian army and through the Russian intelligentsia caught up those Bundists who had signed on to the Soviet Bolshevik project, but were still suspect. And so they were off. You see all these death dates for these figures, 38, 37, 39. What else? Stalinist anti-Semitism, communist authoritarianism. I mean, it goes on and on. So why are we hearing about it now and not before? Well, Crabapple has another theory, which she brings in the very first page of the book. Where to start? These views of the Bund led the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And yet, though the Bund was largely obliterated by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the group's opposition to Zionism better explains its absence from current consciousness. Though the Bund celebrated Eastern European Jews as a people, they irreconcilably opposed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. The diaspora was home, the Bund argued. Jews could never escape their problems by dispossession of others. Instead, Bundists created the doctrine of Doigkeit, or here-ness. Jews had the right to live in freedom and dignity wherever they stood. They would fight for a better and more beautiful world, even alongside people they had been raised to see as enemies. So because they broke the Zionist consensus, she argues, nobody wants to talk about them. We should hide their information, not let people know they existed. Now, it is definitely true that the Zionists did oppose the Bund. We know that in the 30s, and we know that even after the war. She gives several examples, even in DP camps, of conflicts between the groups. And we also know that they were very opposed to the use of Yiddish in the Jewish state. There are stories, one of the scholars that she cites as having helped her in the book is a man named Jack Jacobs. And Jack spoke at a conference that our institute held in the late 1990s, talking about the Bund and about Yiddish diaspora autonomism. And he pointed out some of the conflicts between the Zionists and the Bundists in Israel, in the state. For example, they were denied permission to publish a Yiddish daily newspaper. And the argument that was given was they didn't have the correct movable type. If you know anything about Yiddish, it's written in the same Hebrew letters as Hebrew. So what did they do? They published one Yiddish newspaper on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and they published a different Yiddish newspaper on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. It was the same paper with the same people, just a different name on the masthead. So it wasn't a daily. But there were also incidents of newspaper kiosks that sold Yiddish papers getting firebombed. Because how dare they? It's going to lead them astray. So these conflicts between the two are not made up. There absolutely was this. And there was also an ethos after the war of Yiddish was the language of death. It was the language of passivity. And Zionism was, and Hebrew in particular, was the language of fighting back and strength and courage and so on. But there's another factor that I find that Crabapple doesn't talk about, and I find that a lot of advocates for the Bundist legacy don't talk about, because they don't want to talk about it, I think. Consider what life was like in post-war Jewish America. You had first and foremost the McCarthy era and the persecution of anything to the left of center, maybe. And certainly if you were part of a socialist organization, even an explicitly anti-communist organization, as the Worker Circle was, and she does talk about that, nevertheless, it was suspect. And so you had dozens of secular Jewish schools organized on a leftist political philosophy in the 1920s, even into the 1930s. In the 1950s, almost none. And even if they tried to reorient as being about Jewish culture and Yiddish language, it couldn't fool them. Couldn't fool the people who didn't want to be at risk. But there was another factor, and that is that after World War II, American Jews started to do pretty well for themselves. They used to be not only the leaders of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, they used to work in the factories. Do you know any Jews that work in factories today? On the bottom? We've been successful. We've gone to college. We own houses. We own cars. And you're less inclined to support a workers' revolution when you own a lot of stuff. It's when you don't have stuff that you want to upend everything, but it changes when you have more stuff. So ultimately, Jewish upward mobility led to a decline in empathy for the socialism of the Bund. The Bund attached itself to Yiddish. Well, what happens to foreign languages when they come to America? After a generation or two or three, they fade. I know people named Lopez who don't speak Spanish because it's farther back in their family and it's just not part of their active culture anymore. And on the political side, you heard of something called the New Deal? Do you know how much of the New Deal's platform came from the Socialist Party platform from 20 or 30 years before? Social Security is one example. Well, if you could vote for the respectable Democratic Party that had a chance of winning instead of the dead-end Socialist Party that was never going to get anywhere, well, maybe you make this, and you get 80%. You get where you're going. There were districts in Chicago that voted 95% for Franklin Roosevelt because they were these dense Jewish neighborhoods and they supported the person who gave their educated kids jobs with the WPA and painting murals. And so it was in their personal interest, but it was also in their values interest because it was reflecting these progressive political values that they had imbibed from their parents who had learned it in the shops from these labor organizers. And that's the world in which Bernie Sanders was born and raised in New York, born in 1941. So he comes by his socialism naturally. It was in the air in New York in that period. And so in some ways, he is an heir to the Bund, even if he doesn't talk about cultural diaspora autonomy. That's not part of his platform. The Bund was made up of workers with a few intellectuals. But socialists today, in my anecdotal experience, tend to be more college educated, a little bit more affluent backgrounds. Intellectuals, artists, college students or graduates. So it's a paradox. It's a kind of bourgeois Bundism. Wouldn't make sense in the old world, but maybe it makes sense for some today. Of course, the ship has sailed on Yiddish for a daily language for everybody except the ultra-Orthodox, who do still speak it. It's an irony now, another one, that originally Yiddish was the daily language, the Mama Loshen, what you spoke with your mom, and Hebrew was the Loishen Kodesh, the holy language that you used only for special events. But now for some, particularly those who are trying to reclaim this Bundist legacy, they're not speaking Yiddish to their kids. It's not their daily, English is their daily language. But if they want to sing a meaningful song, maybe it'll be in the new holy language of Yiddish. That's the other reason why I find the Bund to be relevant today. It's the evolution of Jewish politics. There's a reason why this book has hit the New York Times bestseller list and why the Bund remains important. Surveys consistently show that non-Orthodox Jews tend to be liberal, sometimes very liberal. They're pro-choice, they're pro-separation of religion and government, they're pro-social safety net, they're pro-international cooperation. And long before the college-educated population shifted to the Democrats in the last 10 years or so, for decades, Jews were paradoxically college-educated and earning more money than the typical average income, and yet they were voting for the Democratic Party. As sociologist Milton Himmelfarb famously said, they earn like Episcopalians and they vote like Puerto Ricans. In the days where you could make those kind of statements. Well, why do Jews continue to vote progressively today? By and large. Some claim that there are religious roots for this. You get the new, what's called the religious left, that are trying to reclaim religion for advocating for progressive causes. Justice, justice you will pursue, they would say. Or they might draw on the historic Jewish community connections of communal support, the Kehillah, the Federation. But there's also a more recent history. Those bubbies and zadies, those grandmas and grandfathers, and sometimes great-grandmothers and grandparents, who were part of a working class, and who were moved by this Bundist call to fix their lives and the lives of others here and now, and to make what they called a schöner und a bessere Welt, a better and more beautiful world. And as secular and humanistic Jews, be we capitalist or socialist or somewhere in between, on some level that is our mission too, to improve our lives and the lives of others, and to make a better and more beautiful world. So a lot to think about. I have a lot more to say about the book that I couldn't fit into one program. But it is certainly a fascinating book. I agreed with a lot of what she had to say about the Bund. I disagreed with some of the things she had to say about the Zionist movement because it was thinner and Bund-oriented. She goes out of her way to defend the Bund for their missteps and to castigate the Zionists for theirs. That's fine. I mean, in some ways, it's a corrective to all those histories that dismiss the Bund as a nothing, when the Bund in 1897 and 1910 and 1920, they were the establishment. They were the successful message. And the Zionist was a pipe dream that might have never happened. So who knows where history will lead us. With that, I want to end our service. And I'm going to go back to sharing our screen. This one, there's no audio to sing with, so we won't be singing on a different moment. Let's go from here. All right. And I want to end with this poem by Yehuda Amichai, but I want to explain something about the picture that's on the service as part of it. This picture is of a relatively small synagogue. It's from a relatively small Jewish community in southern Poland that had centuries of history, its own famous Hasidic rabbi and dynasty. The name of the town in Polish is Oswiecim. Oswiecim, right. Which, if you know the German name, is Auschwitz. And you can't see this picture and know where it is without looking back through the history. And that's ultimately part of the dilemma in grappling with the Bund and its legacy, is to know what happens next. They didn't. They did the best they could at the time, what they could do. And in the end, did they lose? They lost, but not necessarily failed. Song without end. Inside the brand new museum, there's an old synagogue. Inside the synagogue is me. Inside me is my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. Inside the museum, a synagogue. Inside it, me. Inside me, my heart. Inside my heart, a museum. And so I invite us to sing together our closing song, Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom Aleichem. Hevenu Shalom, Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. Once again, I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and please wish Shabbat Shalom to the people near you.
Shabbat shalom.
And Shabbat Shalom to all
Shabbat
those online.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.